Yeah, I guess just to kind of kick it off, the first question would be is like, what motivated you to write this book? You know, you write a lot about the pandemic, you write a lot about climate change. The title is After the Apocalypse. And you know, in my work, I actually do a lot of work on climate, so I found it actually some of it very intriguing.
Well, I guess the inspiration of the book was all the events of 2020, uh, which came together. What were we talking about? We're talking about the escalating climate crisis, which of course manifests itself, I think, most immediately in things like the fires out west or the hurricanes on the Gulf Coast. That plus the pandemic, plus the related economic collapse, plus the ineptitude and dishonesty of President Trump and his administration, plus the demands for a reckoning with American racism, not necessarily related to those other matters, but that demand for reckoning then triggering or at least exacerbating the rise of white populism. I'm not sure how old you are, Scott, but I think Bob and I are both old enough to remember 1968 as a really, really, really tough year for all kinds of reasons. We don't need to rehearse all that. But it seemed to me that 2020 was just as bad as, if not worse. And so that was the impetus for me to write this book. And the purpose of the book is to try to understand the implications or ramifications of these crises that we were confronting or were confronting us simultaneously. And because my beat, as it were, is foreign policy, national security policy, I tried to examine the implications of all these things for our role in the world.
I've, like I said, been following your work for a long time, and you've always been like a really important critic of American foreign policy, of American empire. But what I really was intriguing here was how you brought COVID, climate change, Black Lives Matter protests into a larger national security paradigm, which most people don't do. Why did you think it was important to kind of converge all of these ideas together, and not just deal with like domestic versus foreign policy kind of typical narrative?
Well, I mean, I've been a critic of U.S. national security policy for a long time, as you suggest. But I guess what the events of 2020 drove home is that the most pressing national security issue relates to keeping the American people safe and secure where they live. It's a phrase I use in the book, where they live. And I was struck by something that I knew but really hadn't thought about. I was struck by the fact that the prevailing national security paradigm, which I would date from the very beginning of the Cold War, assumes that the threats that we need to worry about are out there. They're in Europe. They're in East Asia. They're in the Persian Gulf. And furthermore, the assumption is that the proper response to those threats centers on accumulating and being prepared to use military force. So when you think about the arc of US policy between, let's say, 1946, 1947, and the present moment, the highlights are wars that we undertake to address those threats out there. Now, Bob, you and I might actually disagree a little bit on whether or not that posture was necessary, let's say back in the late 1940s or the early 1950s. But I bet you we very much agree that by the time we get to the end of the Cold War, the post-Cold War era, that posture, meaning amassing military power to address threats out there, was frankly, counterproductive.
Absolutely.
And when we look at the post-Cold War era, basically from the fall of the Berlin Wall through the Trump presidency, man, we are sending forces to deal with threats out there with great frequency, with not a heck of a lot of success, and at a time when the threats to our well-being and security back here where we live are accumulating, not totally ignored, but sort of treated as an afterthought. So my big message in the book is that the time has come for us to reject the prevailing national security paradigm and to come to a different understanding of the requirements of security centered on concerns back here where we live. That's what's really important.